So once again, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, whether you're joining in via Zoom or if you're watching live on the Oshawa Museum's Facebook page, welcome, or if you're watching afterwards on our YouTube channel. My name is Lisa. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Oshawa Museum, and today we're excited to be showing a virtual walk of our popular Union Cemetery tour. And we're doing this in honor of this being the Jane's Walk weekend. Every time I offer a Jane's Walk, I'm asked, who is Jane and why are we walking with her? Well, Jane's Walk is a series of neighborhood walking tours, and they're named after Jane Jacobs. She was an urban activist and writer. Jane's Walks are held annually during the first weekend in May to coincide with her birthday, and these walks are offered for free. And the idea is to become connected to different neighborhoods and communities within your own backyards. So there is a question and answer function within the Zoom. So if you have any questions along the way, please use the Q&A function and I will answer the questions at the end. If you're watching on Facebook and you have questions, plug the questions into the comments and I will try my best to answer them afterwards as well. So this tour is going to be an abbreviated version of the tour we developed in 2020, and it looks at Oshawa in the 1860s. We're going to give a glimpse of our community during that decade and highlight some individuals who were key players. Maybe they had a milestone or left their mark somehow during that decade. Union Cemetery and the Oshawa Museum are both situated on the traditional territory and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations. Our work on these lands acknowledges the signatory communities of the Williams Treaties, as well as the Mississauga Nation and other members of the broader Indigenous community for their resilience and their long-standing contributions to the area now known as Durham Region. So a little bit about the history of the Union. The Oshawa Union Cemetery was established in 1875 by the Oshawa Union Cemetery Company. Prior to 1875, there was a burial ground in this general vicinity, but as the community grew, the needs of the cemetery grew as well, and the size that was there currently wasn't adequate, so the Oshawa Union Cemetery Company was established to remedy this. The land lying to the west of the Highway 2 entrance is the original Presbyterian Cemetery, and in the early 1800s, it was given by Robert and Euphemia Sears to the Presbyterian Congregation of Whitby. It was used by the communities of both towns as a burying ground until 1875, when it came under the ownership of a holding company. And that's one reason why it is named Union. It's because it's a union of the Oshawa and Whitby communities. It was used by both. It's also Union because it is a non-denominational cemetery, so it's supposed to be a union of different religions and different communities. The Oshawa Union Cemetery Company decided that the needs of the community would be best served by leaving the cemetery in the same location, so the community was already familiar with that Presbyterian cemetery, so they purchased the land around it. The plan for laying out this new cemetery was prepared by landscape architect H.A. Engelhart. He was a renowned landscape architect during that time, and Toronto's Mount Pleasant Cemetery was also designed by him. Now, it wasn't until 1922 that the cemetery became the property of the town of Oshawa through the generosity of George W. McLaughlin. He purchased shares of the Ontario Loan and Savings Company and William H. Thomas. He then turned around and presented this property as a gift to the city of Oshawa. He also secured the title deeds to the adjacent Presbyterian Cemetery, and at this time the land was about 30 acres. Not only did he purchase up all these titles and purchase the cemetery and gifted it to the city, George McLaughlin gave $500, which was to be used to administer the bodies of deceased World War I soldiers to the veterans' plots. As you can see in this image, it prominently features the big mausoleum. And this was constructed by Canada Mausoleums Limited and granted to the city of Oshawa on July 26, 1926. And it's not in this picture, but right at the very front gate on Highway 2, there is the cemetery office. And that was built in 1934 and had originally been used as a funeral chapel. Today, Union Cemetery appears as a serene stretch of land shaded by pine and cedar trees. In 1875, Union Cemetery was described as, quote, large and handsomely laid out grounds, which will not only be quiet and worthy resting place for the dead, but by the care bestowed upon it, be a credit to the living. So what was Oshawa like in the 1860s? Well, we didn't officially become a village until 1850, and we would remain a village throughout the 1860s. As well, Union Cemetery was at this time simply the Presbyterian sections. It wouldn't expand to become the cemetery that we know today until 1875. In 1869, the Directory for the County of Ontario, Oshawa is described in it as such, quote, a village in the township of East Whitby. It contains several large stores, some of which are as large as any in the county. The place is noted for its manufactories, containing as it does the large foundry and agricultural works of the late Joseph Hall, which are the largest in the province. It also contains Whiting's celebrated hand agricultural implement factory, besides 3 grist mills, 3 tanneries, 2 steam cabinet factories, and several smaller works, all of which give employment to a large number of hands, making Oshawa a place unsurpassed in the Dominion for its size. The Directory notes the community has a Masonic and 2 Orange Lodges, as well as a division of the Sons of Temperance. The churches in the community at the time were English, Roman Catholic, Wesleyan, Episcopal, Primitive Methodist, Christian, Bible Christian, Presbyterian, and Baptist. The schools were Grammar and Common United, besides several private ones, and the village boasted several fine hotels. This hopefully gives you a flavor of what the town looked like at the end of this decade. And the first individual we're going to visit on our virtual tour is a man named John Hislop, and his headstone can be found in Section C. By 1860, the village of Oshawa had been governed by a village council for 10 years, with new elections happening every year. So at the beginning of every single year in January, the citizens, and by citizens I mean the males of Oshawa, were expected to go and vote for their new village council every single year. The reeve elected to start the decade was John Hislop. However, information about him is sparse. When we were trying to research and find more about him, it did prove a little bit challenging. In his unpublished History of Oshawa, a man named Samuel Pedlar notes that Hislop was a merchant who operated at the Four Corners in downtown Oshawa. For some time, the business was known as Hislop and Gilchrist, but his partnership with Mr. Gilchrist had dissolved in 1858. The business was later carried on as J&J Hislop, likely for John and his brother Joseph, who died in 1864. John himself passed away not much long after that in 1868. His death notice appeared in the Oshawa newspaper at the time, which was called the Oshawa Vindicator, saying that interment was happening at the Thornton burying grounds. And remember, this wouldn't become Union Cemetery officially until 1875. Despite not much being known about John, far more is remembered about his daughters. John and his wife Elizabeth had 3 children. Their son James died fairly young in 1863, but his daughters Sarah Jane and Fanny left a legacy for Oshawa's educational history. Both were teachers and principals, and Fanny, after her death, left a large sum of money to the school board to give out annually as an award for the highest achieving grade 8 student. It is called the Fanny Hislop Award, which is still being given out, as I understand, in Oshawa's schools today. I've given this tour and I've talked to a number of people who either received that grant or that award themselves, or maybe they had a child or some sort of connection with it. So it's always lovely when we do those tours and people can share stories like that with us. Rachel Carr is buried in the North Presbyterian section, and it's her headstone on the right in this image. She was born about 1800 and married to a man named Thomas Carr. Thomas was the son of Norris and Mary, and he was born in 1798. His brothers, William and John, were early settlers and developers in downtown Oshawa. For a number of years, downtown Oshawa, before it became known officially as Oshawa, was known as Carr's Corners. Together, Rachel and John had 4 children. Her headstone is a tablet design, and when placed beside her husband's tablet, as it is, they resemble the tablets of the Ten Commandments. And let's zoom in a little bit closer to the design on her headstone. It features upside down torches on either side, and this is an ancient symbol of death. As well, it's got a hand pointing, and the hand pointing, if you're ever walking around an older cemetery, you're going to see hands showing up on quite a number of headstones. There are a couple different common motifs. One is hand shaking, and that's very common. It represents a union or perhaps the hope of meeting again. You will quite often see hands pointing upwards, and that represents the direction in which the soul is to travel. But if you take a look at Rachel's, you can see her hand is pointing downwards. It does not mean the opposite of pointing up, however. If the hand is pointing down, more often than not, it is the right hand which is pointing down, and it represents the hand of God, which is pointing to the person who is going to heaven, or sometimes it represents divine intervention. There are curtains on either side of that hand, and the curtains represent the last act of life, which is death. And the scroll did have an inscription many, many years ago. This headstone has unfortunately weathered through the years, so it is difficult to see that the scroll says, "To memory dear." At the bottom is an inscription which says, "Wife, mother, thou hast left us. Oh, how lonely seems the way, but 'tis God that hath bereft us. He will be our faith and stay." Now, Rachel Carr might not have been the first of anything in our community, and at first glance appears to have led a fairly quiet life. But she is important in our history because she was part of our community. She lived here, she raised her children here, she died here. In the 1860s, women would have likely engaged in domestic roles within the home. Some women had careers, and often unmarried women worked as teachers. Ultimately, though, and this is a quote from Canada's history, motherhood was thought to be the goal and the primary social function of every Canadian woman. This socialization process, molding Canadian girls into potential wives and mothers, began early. They were encouraged to play with dolls until they were teenagers. The very first generation of Canadian social feminists actually appeared in the 1860s. As women moved from being predominantly household servants into factories, schoolrooms, nursing homes, organizations began to develop. Local church groups and benevolent societies grew within towns and gave women the chance to move beyond their homes. Also laid to rest in the North Presbyterian section is a man named George Prentice. He was born in Scotland in 1835. And his family arrived in Canada sometime between 1851 and 1857. On January 1st, 1858, George married a woman named Caroline Alexander, and together they had 5 children. He was a blacksmith by trade, but as indicated on his headstone, he was also the captain of the Columbus Volunteer Rifle Company. In the 1860s and into the 1870s, there was a series of events now known as the Fenian Raids, and they had a number of different repercussions for our community and also our country. The Fenian Raids took place between 1866 and 1871, and it was a series of attacks by the Fenian Brotherhood on Canada. They were an organization based in the US who wanted Ireland to be separate from Great Britain. So in order to achieve that goal of theirs, they thought that the best way to do it would be to attack Britain's closest possession, being us here in Canada. There were 5 Fenian raids of note, and all of them ended in failure. One of these attacks was at Ridgeway Station in Niagara, and there was a local man who unfortunately was one of the casualties. Private William Fairbanks Tempest was killed during the attack. He was from Whitby, and he is buried in Toronto. One of the results of the Fenian Raids was the establishment of the 34th Ontario Regiment, who celebrated their 150th anniversary in 2016. The Fenian Raids were also cited as a reason for Canada to push for Confederation. It's the idea that we would be more tightly connected if we were united as one country as opposed to a series of different provinces. As well, One of only Canada's 2 political assassinations took place at the hands of a Fenian sympathizer when Thomas D'Arcy McGee was killed in Ottawa in 1868. So there have only ever been 2 political assassinations in our history. This was the first, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and the second one happened during the October crisis in 1970. George died in 1867 of a disease incurred during the Fenian Raid. He was succeeded as captain by J.E. Farewell, and his funeral was reported in the local newspaper as follows. On Wednesday last, Captain Prentice, late of the Columbus Rifles, was followed to his grave by his companions in arms and a large number of friends. He died on the previous Monday from disease engendered by fatigues and exposures experienced by him when he was out on service with his company at Port Colborne in the spring of 1866, when the first Fenian raid was expected. The funeral left his residence in East Whitby, escorted by the men of his own company. Just north of Oshawa, the procession was met by Lieutenant Colonel Fairbanks and other officers of the 34th, the band, and detachments from Captain Burke's and Michael's Oshawa companies, and the Whitby Infantry Company, which had Captain Darkness for the purpose. The firing party was composed of men of the different companies present. The procession then formed in military order and marched to the solemn music of the band to the Presbyterian burying ground, where the body was deposited with the usual military honors. And what you can see up on the screen is notice of George Prentice's funeral, and that is part of our archival collection at the museum. As we move along to section E, we find the headstone for Thomas Gibbs. He was the eldest son of Thomas Gibbs and Caroline Tate. He was born in Terrebonne, Quebec, where the family lived until 1832 when they moved to Oshawa. His father helped to run the South Oshawa Milling Company, which was owned by their uncle, John Gibbs. When they were older, Thomas and his brother William were sent to England to be properly educated, and they returned to Oshawa, where they helped their father and uncle with the milling business. As time passed, the brothers became known as among the leading millers of Ontario, and within 3 years they had acquired most of the cultivated land from Lake Simcoe to Lake Ontario. When the first village council was elected in 1850, Thomas Gibbs was named Oshawa's first reeve. He tried moving into Canadian politics in 1855 when he ran for the North Ontario riding. However, at that time, he was easily defeated. However, Thomas ran for the South Ontario riding in 1867, our very first election as the country of Canada, and he won that election by a surprising majority. There were strong suspicions that the vote had been fixed or that the voters had been bribed, but despite these suspicions, they could not be proven. In that election, Gibbs beat Father of Confederation George Brown, and if the name's familiar, it's because there's a big college in Toronto named after him. He was also the founder of the Globe newspaper, which today still operates as the Globe and Mail. So that's who Gibbs beat in that very first election. Now, this election was described by a man named Robert Alexander Harrison, a political figure at the time, in his diaries as such. Tuesday, August 27th, to the Central Committee Room. Great excitement in the town about George Brown's election in South Ontario. Gibbs gradually gaining on him, all became satisfied that Gibbs would be the conqueror. When Brown's defeat became really known, there was the wildest excitement in the city. Now, that first federal election was held between August 7th and September 20th, 1867, rather than on one set date like they are today. Another noted difference is the fact that the ballot was not secret. The Secret Ballot Act was introduced in 1874 and not put in practice until the 1878 election, which meant that there were 3 federal elections which took place before that secret ballot. If you were eligible to vote, which at the time meant you were male. If you had gone to vote, you were voting amongst your neighbors, your friends, your employers. And maybe your employer has a different political affiliation than you. So the secret ballot, for so many reasons, is so very important. But there were 3 federal elections that took place before that happened. Gibbs would sit as Member of Parliament until 1874, serving for a time in Sir John A. Macdonald's cabinet. He was actually considered to be a confidant of Sir John A. He was appointed to the Senate in 1880, and he passed away quietly in Oshawa in 1883. And the image that you see, first of all, the picture of Gibbs, him in that amazing facial hair, that is from the Library and Archives Canada. The image on the left is a telegram that we have in our collection, and that was sent out during that election. And I believe it was from Sir John A. telling Gibbs not to be beaten and to depend upon an answer. And our final stop on this virtual walking tour is again in section E, not too far away from Mr. Gibbs, is the headstone for a man named Patrick Thornton. Oshawa's first fire department was organized in 1856 by order of Bylaw 33, and at that time it was made up entirely of volunteers. Chief Engineer Patrick Thornton was the first to organize and equip the volunteer company, and as a result, he became the first fire chief. The Oshawa Fire Department was incorporated as a full-time department by Bylaw 142 on July 20th, 1868. So the Oshawa Fire Department celebrated their 150th anniversary in 2018. So once again, when they established in 1868, they were again under the command of Chief Thornton. He was responsible for 50 men with the fire company and a further 15 men with the hook and ladder company, plus 1 engine, some ladders, and numerous hose lines. Thornton would hold this position until the end of 1879. Which means he was the fire chief during the notable fire in 1872, which saw the destruction of downtown Oshawa. Despite the hard efforts of the Oshawa Fire Brigade, they found themselves unable to keep up with this blaze because, and I'm quoting from the newspaper at the time, quote, "As usual, the water supply gave out." We have a man named C.W. Smith to thank because he had some very quick thinking at the time. He went by horse to Whitby, and again, I'm going to quote from the paper. Inside of an hour and 10 minutes after Mr. Smith left for Whitby, the steamer was playing on the fire, procuring water from the well at Black's Corners. And well did this little Merryweather, under the management of the noble Whitby Fire Brigade, do its work. Nobly did the brigade work. And today the businessmen on the north side of King Street may thank the Whitby Fire Brigade for saving, with their engine, their property. So at the time, Oshawa did not have one of these little Merryweather machines, but we did purchase a steam pumper not long after that instance. That fire was found out many weeks later, months, I'm not quite sure the timeline, but it was discovered to be arson at the time. Someone was hoping to claim an insurance claim. And unfortunately, there were quite a number of buildings at the time that were damaged. When he was not volunteering his time with the fire department, Thornton was a trained machinist, and he learned the trade at the Moscrop Foundry and later working at the Joseph Hall Works. He was also active in municipal politics, and he served on council for a number of years. In 1867, he married a woman named Jane Plews, who herself is notable for being an early doctor in the area. She was a female physician specializing in a branch called eclectic medicine, and it makes use of botanical remedies. It's interesting looking at those early newspapers from the 1860s because you can see quite a few ads for Dr. Jane Plews. And we talk more about her during our Women in Oshawa tour of Union Cemetery. Together, this couple had 1 son named Frederick. And with that, we have come to the end of our virtual tour through Oshawa's Union Cemetery. I'm just taking a look. If anybody has any questions, Please pop them into the Q&A, pop them into the chat. I will do my best to answer them. I will also say that sitting here and doing a virtual tour just doesn't feel quite the same as going on the walking tours that we normally do of Union Cemetery. We are very much looking forward to a time when we can gather again and offer tours like this, a little bit more expanded, and actually walk around and enjoy the space and remember those who are buried in Oshawa's Union Cemetery. Is there a map of the various areas of the cemetery? Yes, there is. I don't have the link ready right now, but you can Google Oshawa Union Cemetery. It is part and operated by the city of Oshawa, so the cemetery and map will show up on the city's website. If you Google Union Cemetery in Oshawa, Union Cemetery map, you should be able to find images of it as well. And it is a very clearly laid out map and very clear and laid out cemetery in that aspect as well. I'll be sure to leave a link for that over on our Facebook page. Thank you very much for that question. If there are no more questions, then I'm going to say thank you once again for joining me this Saturday afternoon. Hopefully we will be able to gather at some point in the future and enjoy this walk together. With that, please everyone, stay well, stay healthy, stay engaged with the Oshawa Museum via social media, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone.